Hey there, guys and gals. Welcome to part 2 of our interview with Colin Grant. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, make sure to go back and give that a listen. As always, make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. That'll keep you up to date with all things I know this guy and helps us grow the show. Anyway, that's enough of me, and I'll see you after the interview.
That must have played on your nerves every single day up to that 3-month period.
It did. I'll tell you why. Well, because I remember saying to my friends, because I had a lot of people who I was talking like a madman towards, and I was talking gibberish, and I was very nervous because even though logically I know that obeah is just voodoo and shouldn't really work, every educated person who will say the same in Jamaica, in their heart, they kind of believe in it. And I was kind of in that camp in a way. When I had this invitation to go to this wonderful literary festival called Calabash in Treasure Beach in Jamaica, I couldn't resist going. In fact, it's where I met Ian Thompson for the first time. Yeah. But when I was due to go on the eve of my departure, my grandmother rang me up and she said, "Colin, don't go to Jamaica. You'll come back in a wooden box." And I had other friends who equally said, I'd come back in a wooden box because it wouldn't be the curse. It'd be the fact that, that it's very easy to pay someone a few $100 to find a gunman who will kill you. And so it wasn't just that I was waiting for some heart attack to arrive unbidden. It was the fact that I feared that maybe there was a contract out of my life. So every time I remember being on this in this lovely beach hut. Every time a kind of security guard walked past, I feared that it was the gunman coming for me. So it was a terrible time. But I got a short story out of it anyway for one of the journals. So you can always find a way to translate your horror into some remuneration. That's what I've been doing for most of my life, actually. Most of my latter years.
Oh, I don't know what year it was. I think it was back in the 70s, but I remember I was in my teens going to, and I don't know why my parents even let me go, but I was in my teens traveling alone, went to Jamaica and went to, I think it was called, tell me if I'm wrong, Reggae Sunsplash?
Yeah, Sunsplash, yeah.
Sunsplash. Way back in the day. So yeah, that was quite the event. But I couldn't even imagine just traveling anywhere, just saying, there you go. Even when we were younger, like I lived outside of Montreal about, 15 miles. And it was nothing just to hitchhike anywhere. And, my parents knew I was doing that and I was hitchhiking everywhere. I had one incident, I got the crap beat out of me. But other than that, we traveled and going into downtown Montreal, going to Jamaica, I could imagine Hayden saying, "Oh, Dad, I'm 16 or whatever age it was. I'm going to be going here or going there." Well, hold it a sec. Matter of fact, he did. He ended up, I can't believe I let you do this, Hayden, but you were traveling all over France. You were traveling. I remember you rang us and said that you were sleeping on a beach in the south of France or something.
Yeah.
So I did let you do that. My gosh. How did you were the oldest, so I guess you were.
The thing is, I told you as I was doing it and not before. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh, but that's great. I'm
being the fear and do it anyway. Isn't that the phrase? The trick is not to think. The trick is just to do it and then worry about it afterwards. I remember reading a short story by J.D. Salinger, who wrote The Catcher in the Rye. And there's a short story he writes about this boy who's very good at playing marbles. You know the game marbles, you hit a little ball, you flick it, you hit another ball.
Yep.
You know the game?
Yep.
And there's this expert marble player, scores the top score every time. And one of his friends asked him, how do you manage to do that? And he says, the trick is not to aim. The trick is not to aim. So the trick is not to think too deeply about something, just to do it. And you might be surprised by how wonderfully you can do it without fear, I think.
Well, let's talk about that. Have you ever just gone and done something, thought about it later, and then, oh man, that could have been really bad?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've had a fair few, especially in Jamaica, moments like that where I would go into areas where I knew that there had been battles between gunmen, and there'd be bullet holes in the walls. And I'd go there because I wanted to talk about the nature of, in Jamaica, there is a kind of two-party system. And the phrase that you often hear, the two parties, the Jamaican Labour Party and the People's National Party. And the phrase is, when your party is in, you eat. When the other man's party is in, you starve. And so there's always this tension. And I wanted to go to the kind of borderlines where there was opposing groups. But having gone there, I don't know if you've ever been to a place where you felt that bad things have happened in the recent past, and they may happen again. So just a terrible vibe. And I just walked with trepidation down the street. I went with a middleman and some priests, some very brave clergymen who were kind of selling the gospel on the street, but actually they were trying to act as healers to repair the breach between these two groups. But it's like, walking down the OK Corral and wondering, whether the various rivals had got the message that there should be a truce that afternoon. And so that was a bit of a stupid thing to have done. And again, though it gave me a good story to write about, sometimes you have to be cognizant of the fact that you can maybe be too confident or too uncaring about the consequences that may befall you. So sometimes you need to just do some due diligence and do a test before you embark on something.
So let's talk a little bit about the BBC. What was it like? And did you feel a lot of pressure, working with the world's largest news service?
Well, in a way, it was the reward I wanted to give my parents because I hadn't become a doctor. I thought, what can I find that is going to be close enough to them in terms of the kind of kudos that you attach to an organisation that's not quite being a doctor. So to be a member of the British Broadcasting Corporation still does carry quite a lot of kudos, but had even more kudos when I joined. And I joined at a time when there were very few black people. I worked in the organisation. I worked primarily in the beginning for the BBC World Service. And I remember joining as a trainee producer. I went to the newsroom. I was working in the newsroom. And this is a newsroom broadcasting around the world. And there were no black people in the newsroom. So that was really peculiar. It was almost like an arm of colonial expansion in a way. It was almost like we were stepping back into the time of empire. And it was kind of clear that I hadn't the same kind of trajectory through university to be in the newsroom. Because when people talk about diversity back in the 1990s, early 1990s when I joined, diversity in the BBC meant, well, did you go to Oxford University or Cambridge University? That was the diversity. So a person like me was very strange, and there weren't many people like me when I joined. So I was very conscious of that. I was also very conscious of the fact that I had a kind of different cultural sensibility and came with a different cultural baggage or cultural way of looking at things. When I joined, it was almost as if I was the man who was sort of steeped in reggae, joining an organization where they only played heavy metal. It had that kind of, there's that kind of disparity. But I was enamored of the BBC because I think they did have, and they still do have some fine qualities. And they drilled into me this notion that the most important thing is accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. And I think that served me very well in the cause. But I worked in the newsroom for several years, and then I tunneled my way out of the newsroom into the arts. So I worked as an arts producer for quite a few years. And again, I had a great time, and I made some wonderful programs, and very lucky to meet and interview people like Philip Glass and Arthur Miller, people like that. Wonderful artists as well. I went to places like the Venice Biennale. And it was curious to me and important to me that I also had to ensure that I would be cognizant of the fact that I could change some of the stories that were being written. A lot of the time, the commissioners commission according to what they know, according to their own backgrounds. And that can lead to a very sort of narrow way of broadcasting what is important. So whilst I was at the BBC, I was determined to broaden the outreach, especially when it came to the arts. And there were various moments of tension when that arose. So, for instance, I remember back in the 1990s, it was great to be in the BBC, and I did love being in the BBC, and I do owe the BBC a lot. But the BBC were very, very nervous about anything to do with race, and often that's when tensions arose because they didn't know how to be level-headed about it. So there was one instance, for instance, when a man called Willard White, who's this great opera singer, Jamaican-born opera singer, one of the greatest opera singers in the world. we had a program called Masterclass, and he came in and we were going to interview him. And I say we, I was the producer. And there was a very fine presenter called Harriet Gilbert, a white woman. And her colour is important, not because it means anything other than there's this nervousness about white people and black people when it comes to any kind of broadcast material. So Harriet was interviewing Willard White about how things have changed in the BBC over the years, because things have changed and things have changed in the culture. And she said to him, "Oh, Willard, when you first started back in the 80s and 90s, there were very few black people in the arts. There was no significant black actor at the National Theatre or the Royal Shakespeare Company. There were no significant opera singers at the Royal Opera House. So things have changed, Willard, because now you will find that there is a black Henry V. You'll find at the National Theatre that the character playing Sky Masterson in Guys and Dolls will be a black actor. So things have improved, haven't they, Harriet? Haven't they, Willard?" She said. And Willard White answered very slowly. He said, "Well, you tell me, Harriet, you're white. You white people control things. I wasn't in the room when they decided whether I would or wouldn't get the job. So you tell me." And there was this frisson, there was this sparks are flying. It was a real bit of drama and real tension. And in a way, it was the best part of the interview. And at the end of the interview, both Harriet and I were delighted. And we kind of gave each other high fives and said, "Oh, we've got some heat there." And I remember taking the program to the play-out area. And the next day I had to California, actually, for another program. And somebody up in the upper echelons of the BBC heard about the interview and summoned one of my friends to go and retrieve it and listen through to him, and then ordered one of my friends to cut out the heat, cut out the argument between, well, there was an argument, just cut out that moment of discomfort. And I was incensed when I heard about it, because they did. They just cut it out. They got some scissors. Back in the day, you had quarter-inch tape with, reels on reels to reels, and you marked your edits with a Chinograph, and you literally took some scissors and cut it out, and you spliced it all together. And when I got back from my trip, I think that led, and I can talk about this now without much censure, that led to my first disciplinary hearing, because I was vexed. And I didn't show my vex, but I showed maybe I sighed too heavily in the presence of my manager, or I would raise an eyebrow, or I'd look at the clock, or I'd drum my fingers on the desk. And I was then invited to a disciplinary hearing because apparently I'd shown aggression to my manager. I was accused of being aggressive. And I was shocked actually by this, because all my life I'd been schooled to be deferential and respectful. I'd been a head boy at school. I went to medical school. I'm now in the BBC, doing things which black people don't ordinarily do. And so when I was accused of being aggressive, I was summoned to a senior manager's office and asked to explain myself. And I said, no, I'm not accepting that word. I'm not aggressive. If I was white and had been to Oxford or Cambridge, you would say, I'm assertive. I said, I'll accept the word assertive, but I'm not going to accept the word aggressive, because aggressive is a word that you've been using. White people in Britain, who are the descendants of colonial masters, have been using to characterize black people over decades and centuries. So I reject that word. And so this manager turned to me and said, oh, that's interesting. So you're accusing us of being racist, are you? So let's investigate your accusation of racism whilst we continue to investigate your aggression. And I said, this is ridiculous. But anyway, this went on. And so they investigated me. I was put on, it's like being put on trial. And I was put on trial for about 6 months. And the hierarchy of the BBC, they interviewed every single person that I'd ever worked with within the BBC. And I'd been there for a number of years. And after 6 months, I was again summoned to the manager, and he had the verdict in front of him. And he said, the case against you is not proven. And that was it. So in other words, he felt, and they felt I was guilty, but they couldn't prove it. And so that was the culture. So I stayed, and I stayed for another 10 years, actually, because I did have lots of friends and allies there. But that was a kind of culture whereby if you raise your head as a black person and you introduce any kind of discomfort over race, you can find yourself in hot water pretty damn quickly. So that's one of the poor things about the BBC. But there are very many great things about the BBC. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's still a wonderful public service broadcaster which does great things to act as a kind of glue, a cohesive force for Britain, but also it sells a greater idea of Britain than maybe Britain presently is. It sells that idea around the world to people who regard Britain, who think highly of Britain through the regard they feel for the BBC.
Outside of that incident, did you ever feel limited because of race?
Yeah, well, I recognise now that at that moment, then there are things I couldn't say if I wanted to stay within the BBC. I mean, I didn't feel limited because I felt that people were racist. I mean, I would never use the word racist, actually. But I felt that actually the people who have hands on the levers of social control need to be changed, because often those people, and sometimes the commissioners, as I said earlier, they are very narrow in their world outlook, and they're mostly commissioned for people like themselves, or commissioned for people who they imagine are like themselves. So the challenges that I've had have been to try to wrest away the levers of social control from the people who currently have their hands on them, but also to convince people that people like me are not the enemy. That in fact, that cultures like the culture in Britain, enriched by people like me, enriched by Caribbean people, and especially when you consider what's been going on, I don't know whether you've been familiar with this great Windrush scandal that's been going on in Britain over the last few years, whereby people like my parents of that generation have, late in the day, 50 years after they've been in this country, have been wrongly classified as illegal immigrants and deported. When you hear those sorts of things, you recognize that actually things haven't changed, that the hostile environment that was introduced in Britain by the Tory party in 2012 was there back in the 40s and even before. So I felt limited in that regard, but thankfully things have changed. And the very fact that I've been able to write books that deepen the story about the black presence in Britain, or deepen the story about the fact that, as we say in Jamaica, all of we is one. We're all part of the culture. The more that happens, the more likely those kinds of difficulties that I found myself in 10, 15 years ago in the BBC will be things of the past. They won't be things that recur, I hope. But also, in the future, I think we'll find that the people who get on will be the people who recognize that we are all part of one big culture, and that there are no people who are either perpetrators or victims. In my surname is Grant. My skin is black. My parents are black Jamaicans. But my skin isn't fully black. If you look at my skin color, you'll see that somewhere down the line, there has been some white input into the gene pool. So somewhere down the line, I'm the descendant both of some slave owner or overseer who raped one of my foremothers. So I'm that person's descendant. I'm descendant of the perpetrator and the victim. And I can't claim ownership of one exclusively. And I think it's important to recognize that. Because until we do, we will continue down this path of living in silos of separation. And in a way, I hope that the kind of writing that I do, which I hope is nuanced and funny and interesting and complicated, will complicate the story and will encourage people to see that there is commonality of purpose in all cultures, no matter where people came from. I mean, sometimes we hear about this phrase, you are either a citizen of somewhere or nowhere. And I would say that we are all both, because most of the people on this planet have had some forebear that came from somewhere else. So we're all immigrants in a way. And I think the problems that I've had in the BBC and problems that some people like me have had in our culture have been through people who haven't recognized that, who think that they are the homogenous people who are part of a culture that has always been there. There's a very famous book by a man called Peter Fryer called Staying Power. And it's a history of black people in Britain. And I always say the only funny problem about that book is that the most important book on black British history in the UK is written by a white man. And I salute him. Peter Fryer was a white Marxist historian. And he wrote a fantastic book which showed that actually black people were here in the UK at the time of the Roman Empire. And he has this funny line where he says there were Africans in Britain before there were English people. So I think I would like to continue in that vein to remind people that we are all, if we dig down into our gene pool, we're all connected.
Nice. That is an interesting line, though. There were black people in Britain before there were English people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, he says there were Africans in Britain before there were English people.
Well,
Yeah.
And let's talk about, because you touched on it. You wrote a book called Homecoming, and it's a collection of short stories about the Windrush generation. And I wanted you to go down that path a little bit. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. No, I loved writing that book because it was an oral history of Caribbean migration to Britain from 1945 or thereabouts to 1962, which is a kind of key period. And with that book, I personally interviewed over 60 people, and I had archive from other collections, people who'd done their own oral histories in the past, and people who'd been interviewed by the BBC, the British Library. So there are over 128 voices in that book. And I was determined to cast the net widely, because this period, I'm talking about this Windrush period, and this idea of black people, black Caribbean people in Britain, too often it's focused on the Jamaicans. Jamaicans take up too much room. They make too much noise. They have too large a space in the culture. They have too great a regard for themselves. And I say this as a child of Jamaican parents. So I was determined to spread the love, to show that there were other Caribbean people arrived from Antigua, St. Kitts, St. Vincent, Trinidad, Tobago, Barbuda, Bermuda, everywhere. So there are people from all of the islands. And what I've done, I've tried to show the degree to which when these people arrived, they arrived with the sense that they were British. So when my mother was growing up in Luton, in Jamaica in the 1940s, when you went to the cinema in Jamaica to see a film, at the beginning of the screening, you would stand up to sing the British national anthem. This was in Jamaica. At the end of the screening, you would stand up to sing the British national anthem. When I was growing up in this place called Luton in the 60s, when my mum was cleaning in the house on a Saturday morning, she would be reciting Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, Kipling. Gunga Din was her favorite. She could recite these things verbatim. All of her education was through the prism of being British. She knew more about Britain than she knew about Jamaica. And I wanted to show that was a kind of innocence that these people had when they arrived, because when they arrived, there were lots of wonderful intersections with people. There were lots of great welcomes, but there was lots of hostility as well. And I wanted to show the degree to which the Caribbean people have this great chutzpah, have this great spirit. They take things on the chin and they move on. When people do them wrong, they pull the collar up on their coat and they walk on. And time, I found this. But what I was determined to show was that there was a lot of humor as well. So when people arrived in the 50s and 60s from the Caribbean, they were coming to Britain, coming to London especially, which had a lot of glamour attached to it. Even the name London had glamour attached to it, but also streets like Oxford Circus or Piccadilly Circus. There's a man called Wallace Collins who came to Britain in the 1950s, and he's in the book, and he talks about the fact that when people arrive, they'd often get photographs of themselves taken and send these snaps back home to say, look how well I'm doing. And he went to Trafalgar Square, and I won't swear. And he went to Trafalgar Square, and he says, whilst we were there, a pigeon came and dropped something on his head, shall we say. And he wrote back with a photograph to his family and said, I am making history. And I love that idea. They had this kind of innocence about them, but also they had a lot of wit and humor. And again, I was renewed in my enthusiasm for the human race by listening to these elderly people. They're all in their 80s and 90s now. And one of the things I was struck by was that these people that I interviewed were all very nervous about being interviewed, because there's a phrase you might even hear it in Toronto. If you were to go into a house, a West Indian household or a Caribbean household, you might hear the phrase, me don't like people chat my business, which means they don't like people to talk about them. They don't have to share their stories, because you never quite know what can be done with those stories. And so whenever I went to interview these people, that I had to disabuse them of the notion that I was a wrong one, that I was going to do them harm. And my approach was often to act the fool, to be a kind of idiot, to pretend that I knew nothing and that they would feel sorry for me. And they would volunteer their stories. But time and again, what was clear was that all of the interviews that I did over 60 interviews, they all went on for 3 or 4 hours. All of the interviews were policed by the adult children of these Windows generation folk. And they were more savvy and wary and cynical about someone like me, whom they considered a journalist. I'm not really a journalist, but they thought of me as a journalist. And it was only by just abusing them, of assuring them I wasn't going to, in a way, disgrace their parents, that they allowed me in. But in the course of interviewing people, I began to feel almost as if I was like a producer on a television show we have here called the Antiques Roadshow, which is a television show where a team of specialists go out into this country, and they encourage people to bring, almost as if to a fair, antiques. Have been up in their attics, artifacts, special pots and pans or miniature statues, medals. And often the people bringing these antiques to the Antiques Roadshow are kind of delighted by the backstory and learn that the thing that's been lurking in their attic for 30 years has great value. And when I went to interview these Caribbean people, I recognized that I was like a producer on the Antiques Roadshow, but the antiques were their stories that hadn't been readily told. Or if they had been told, they'd been told to bored children or bored grandchildren who'd stopped listening or hadn't paid attention to the detail of the story. And I was going to rush down these stories, polish them up and reveal them for the jewels that they really were. And all through the interviews, there was this tension that I was trying to articulate that was often felt from the very beginning between couples sometimes. There were those in the couple who wanted to stick and stay when they arrived in the 50s and 60s and remain. And there were those like my mother, the romancers and the dreamers, who wanted to go back to the Caribbean. And when I was growing up in Luton, there was a newspaper that was imported from Jamaica called the Gleaner, the Jamaican Gleaner. And on the back of the Gleaner, there would be adverts for plots of land that could be bought in Jamaica and architectural drawings for buildings that could be built on those plots of land. And every Friday afternoon when the paper arrived, my mother would take a pen and she'd ring the advert that she spied as the best plot of land. She said, "We're going back." And she'd say to us, "Oh, don't get too comfortable. Don't get too comfortable. We're only passing through. This world is not our resting place." But she never went back. Until when I worked at the BBC, I managed, probably about 15 years ago now, to persuade the BBC to allow me to take my mother back to Jamaica. My mother's in the book, Ethlyn's in the book. Because one of the chapters is about this idea of return. So my mother had never been back to Jamaica for 40 years. You know, she suffered from that whole notion, J.P. Hartley notion, the past is a foreign country. I think she didn't go back because I think she knew that it had changed, that it was going to be very different from the place that she left. And she wanted to hold on to the old idea that she had. So we went with a little bit of fear and trepidation on my mother's part to the airport. When we flew to Jamaica, I'd been before, but I flew with her for the first time now. She hadn't been back for 40 years. And Norm, when that plane touched down, when she stepped down onto the tarmac of the airport, I'd never seen such a transformation. She was singing, she was laughing, she was looser, she was being cheeky with all the local people. She was singing songs about the local penitentiary where my grandfather would take prisoners on remand to the penitentiary. It was as if suddenly, like an artist, she was drawing on all of the colours of the palette. Whereas growing up with her in England, she seemed to have lived a rather reduced life, as if she was only drawing on a small number of the colours. And I suddenly thought, wow, what if she had stayed as a young woman and lived and grew up and had children in Jamaica? Would she have been as vibrant and as colourful, as full a person as she seemed to be then? Wouldn't that have been better? So I felt a little bit sadness on her part, but she felt no sadness. And I again admire people like my mother and all of her peers, all of the peers of the Windrush generation, because they made this kind of sacrifice that they were going to see that they could make a better life for themselves and their children by migrating, because things are rough in Jamaica. So I admire and honor them for that. And finally, one of the things that characterized that for me most fully was the story of the Barrel Children. I'm sure you have them in Canada and North America as well. But the Barrel Children is a phrase that refers to the fact that when migrants from the Caribbean left to go either to America, or Canada, or to Britain, sometimes they might have been married, a young couple, and they could afford to take themselves to Canada, America, Britain, but they couldn't afford to take the children. So they would leave the children in the care of the grandparents, and then they would soon come for them. That was the phrase. We soon come. They soon come for you. But sometimes it took years. And in the interim, the children began to perceive the grandparents as the parents. And now, years later, when the parents, the real parents, had saved up enough money to bring the children over, they might have started another family in the UK or Canada or America. And so there was a great trauma of the children in Jamaica, say, having to leave their grandparents with whom they formed an attachment. There's a great trauma and feeling of being bereft on the part of the grandparents. And when the children arrived now to meet their biological parents in the UK, there was difficulty in bonding. They didn't know how to be with each other. And I interviewed several people. I didn't realize how prevalent it was. I'd say a third of the people that I interviewed had either been Barrel children or been parents of Barrel children. And I interviewed a woman called Rena Kublal from British Guyana, who's in her late 70s, early 80s now. And she left Guyana and left 3 young children behind. The youngest was 9 months and the oldest was 5 years. And her husband took 5 years to send for, we soon come for you, to send for the children. And equally, when those children arrived, they didn't have to embrace their parents, and their parents didn't really know how to embrace them. There was great difficulties. I mean, eventually they did, obviously, and they lived full and rich and loving lives. But when I interviewed Rina Kubal, she told me that still today, she mourns those 5 years when she had to be absent from her children. So as well as there being great humor and liveliness, there was great sorrow in the book as well. But I'd like to finish though on a positive note, because I think they're very proud of their achievements, people who I interviewed, and they don't see themselves as victims. The most important word in the Caribbean lexicon is respect. It comes out of the disrespect that was shown to people during the time of slavery. And the first thing you showed each other after slavery was respect. So this idea of respect is very, very important to them. And I felt really aggrieved on their part when some of these people these respectful Caribbean people who 50 years after were then deported to the Caribbean. It was an egregious act on the part of the British government. But they have maintained their dignity. And thankfully, through the great work of journalists like Amelia Gentleman at the Guardian newspaper here in the UK, their plight has come to light, and they are late in the day, but hopefully and fully, I think, will be shown the respect that they fully deserve.
We talked trauma earlier. We talk about, I know that in the States, people have seen something similar, illegal immigrants being shipped back to the States. And there's all sorts of incredible documentaries showing the trauma associated with it. But first of all, I've never thought about it in England. When I was doing the research for this podcast, it was the first time I heard of this. And I couldn't imagine being on the other end, living in a country that you grow up, to find out that now you're going back because you're not part of this society.
It's terrible. It's terrible, but also it's dangerous as well, because the idea is that you leave poor and you return wealthy. So the greatest insult to these people is that they're having to return with their tail between their legs. Sometimes they're even in cuffs. And they're now deposited in a country which they don't know very well. They may not even have any relatives there anymore. But they're perceived by some local people, by some gangsters, to be wealthy, and they will be preyed upon. And sadly, some of those people have been killed. So it's a great, great tragedy and a great shameful act on the part of the British government and other governments that are doing similar kinds of things. But thank God there are people who are countervailing and countering such attitudes and remembering and reminding people that migrants who are from the Caribbean in this country, as they say, we are here because you were there. And I think that's an important point to amplify and to keep on reminding people that there's a shared story, and that Caribbean people, African people who were enslaved and brought to the Caribbean, wouldn't come to England if the English hadn't been to Africa and to the Caribbean and plundered both people and countries for their own prosperity.
Do you know how many people were deported?
The problem is that the British government have not given a full account. They said it was only 60 or 70 people have been remunerated or brought back or given back their passports. But there are lots and lots of undocumented people who have gone back, who have just disappeared into the countryside and don't know what's going on. I mean, I've interviewed people who are not part of the so-called Windrush scandal, who would have gone back, for instance, for a funeral. I mean, I interviewed a guy who went back for a funeral. He'd been brought to Britain as a boy of 9 years old, and had never had a passport because he didn't need a passport. When I was growing up in the UK, no one ever had to carry any documents. And there are many people, I mean, this is hard to believe, but there are many people who've never left the country. And so, you wouldn't need to get a passport if you're not going to leave the country. So some of these people, sadly, they'd have left the country just to go to a funeral, and they wouldn't have the right documents to show on the way back. And so I interviewed this man, but he'd been out of the country for 20-odd years, more than 20 years. So he's not part of the statistics, and I'm sure there are lots and lots of people like him. But equally, he said to me, because there'd been some noise made by the government that they will allow them, what do they say? It's not permanent citizenship, but it's the right to abode for a certain period of time. Indefinite leave to remain, that's the phrase. And this man, Ken, said, I don't want indefinite leave to remain. I want my passport. And if they don't want to give me back my passport, they can keep it. And I like that kind of spirit amongst all the people I spoke to, that they're not going to allow the insult into their soul. They're not going to be so affected that it's going to affect the way that they think of themselves. They're going to expel it. They're going to turn it back towards the people who are trying to do them wrong. And I found that again and again and again throughout the book. There's I'll tell you one funny story. I interviewed this guy who was talking about the fact that a lot of people from the Caribbean found it difficult to get work when they arrived because there's a lot of prejudice on the part of the employers. And Mr. Eric Johnson told me that he'd see an advert and he'd arrive at the job interview only to be told, "Oh, Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry. That job's gone. If only you'd arrived just the hour earlier, it would have been so different, but I'm afraid that's gone." And this happened to him time and time again. And he said to me, "Boy, the Englishman is the nicest man in the world when he's telling you no." So what they did, they used humor as a shield.
I hear about it coming from the States, Canada less. I grew up in a town. It's now a pretty big city where it was basically all white. And we became a university town, which that was mid-60s, I think, was the first time I ever saw anybody come into the town of color. And the interesting part, though, I did see some racism. I did see some. But the town was actually very welcoming. In Canada, I'm sure there's still all sorts of prejudice or racism with undertones of racism for sure. However, nothing like, some of the things that I've seen more in the South. What was it like, for your parents? Did they talk about coming over and facing a ton of racism or prejudice?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think, and I remember both my parents saying they preferred the Americans, the North Americans, because Americans didn't like you and would tell you to your face that they didn't like you, whereas the British had this kind of faux politeness. My father used to say they were polite to the point of being rude. So it was kind of almost a kind of sarcastic politeness. What would you like now, sir? But my father was a very amused man, and he had a very amusing and amused approach to any kind of sentiment of disrespect. Because also he was doing things that he ought not to do, I suppose. I mean, there were things in my father's car when he did eventually get a car that ought not to be there. Not just the marijuana, but he was getting knockoff beer from the local American army base and selling it to his friends. So, and it's very instructive to me to pay attention to how my father dealt with white policemen, because we were stopped quite a lot by the police. We were stopped by a lowly, a beat policeman, like a police constable. And my father would promote the police constable immediately. So police constable blogs became detective inspector blogs, chief constable blogs. And we'd be so amused by my father's experience that he would wave us on. And I remember thinking about that attitude and that strategy as well, being quite a useful one to adopt through life. So I learned from that, or I thought I learned from that. If you spool forward now, maybe 20 or so years after the story I just told you about my father promoting the policeman. So now I'm a BBC producer in the newsroom, and I'm producing a program which is a kind of version of what the papers say the next morning, where you rifle through the first editions at 10 p.m. and you write an account of what are the key stories. And your shift would finish at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And at that time, I lived not very far from the centre of town, a place called Wapping. And I would get into my car and I would drive down to the Thames River, turn left towards home. But once a month, I would get into my car, drive down to the Thames River at 3 o'clock in the morning, and boom, stopped by the police. And it got so bad that I'd drive the other way. I'd drive up and away from the Thames, over to this place called Holborn, over to Clerkenwell. I'd go around the very long way to get to my home and maybe add another 30, 40 minutes to the journey, but at least it saved me the hassle, saved me the aggravation. Until one day I had this feeling, do you know what? I'm just going to go the quickest way home. I'm going to risk it. So I got into my car, very nice Ford Capri. I drive down to the River Thames and turn left and bang, I'm stopped by the police. There are 2 policemen. One of them is black, and they always get the black guy to do the bad stuff. So I'm having a discussion with this black police constable. And I'm saying, what is it now, officer? And I'm getting a bit shirty. Do you know that expression? I'm getting a bit irritated. And he says, there are cobwebs on your bumper. And I said, you're stopping me because there are cobwebs on your bumper. And I'm getting a bit irate now. And suddenly I hear this voice in my head. And the voice is, well, what would your father say? So I turn to this police constable and I say, well, Detective Inspector. And the police constable says, who are you calling Detective Inspector, mate? And I said, who are you calling mates, mate? And what I haven't recognized is that my father is the kind of working class Caribbean man who sounds deferential. Whereas when I say it, I sound like a snobbish middle class idiot who's patronizing the working class policeman. And so the lessons that I've learned from my father aren't always that useful. But I think humility is a good lesson to learn. And although my parents did meet prejudice, I think, on a daily basis, really, they recognized that they had to get through life and that they couldn't fight all the battles. They would just sort of shrug and let some things go. and recognise that they would have said this consciously, but I think they recognised that the problem was more the problem of the person who is the perpetrator of such behaviour than it is the person whom they want to be the recipient of such behaviour. So again, I'd say that my parents would be people for whom the prejudice was transmitted, but they didn't receive it.
That's interesting. It sounds like there's a parallel here, to what's going on right now.
Yeah.
But
they weren't in denial. They weren't. Is that what you mean? They weren't like the outgoing president of America, who's been transmitted the notion that he should leave the house, but is not receiving the lesson. They're not like that, but they're more like the idea that pity the poor perpetrators of prejudice. They know, not necessarily they don't know what they do, but they're diminished by it more than they diminish the person whom they're trying to hurt. I think that's what my parents would say.
Right. Okay. I want to just talk to you about something. This is while you were talking a little while back about Jamaica. This is just something interesting. Years ago, when I went, this might have been my first time there. This might have been my second time there. I was by myself. I was on just a bus ride, and the tour ended up on this beach. So we got off on the beach and we laid down and we, got in our sand for an hour or two, or sun for a couple hours. And the beach was Negril Beach. It did not have a single hotel. And when I think of it now, it actually makes me kind of sick, kind of sad, just seeing, maybe like for everybody who's prospering and for the tourist industry, that's great. But to be on that beach when it was basically virgin ground, and then to see what it turned into, it's actually kind of sad.
Yeah, no, it is. And you see that up and down the country, actually, that there are these private beaches now where the local people are not permitted to lay on the sand. And there are all these chains of hotels where the people don't leave the hotel and they don't interact with the local people, which is a great shame, a great tragedy. But I think, I'm maybe wrongly, my wife always says I'm too much of an optimist, but I would like to think that this is a blip, okay, a very long blip, but it's a blip, and that people will change and people will get fed up with that kind of seclusion or exclusion, and they'll want to reach out and to meet and to know their strangers. Mm-hmm. But I think things will change. Things will happen in the future which we are unaware of. I mean, who could have foretold? Maybe people would have foretold that we would be having this kind of conversation via this platform a year or two ago. Who could have foretold that we wouldn't go to the cinema? And I've lived a life where, through my parents, I've seen that you can live with uncertainty, because what is certain today will not be so tomorrow. It was not certain at all to my parents that there would be any possibility for someone like me to be a producer in the premier broadcasting corporation in Britain. But it's every day now. When that shifts, when those shifts happen, when the people become the managers of these exclusive hotels, don't share the outlook of the people who presently run them, then things will change. So so rest assured, I'm sounding like an old guy now teaching young Norm.
Yeah.
Rest assured, there will come a time when we turn away, for instance, from digital back to analog. There will come a time when we open the gates of these exclusive gated communities and welcome strangers into our hearts. I'm sure of it.
It would be nice if that happened. All right. Okay, so when we talked to you originally, we asked you if you had a quote that you could provide, something either by yourself or by somebody that you would like to provide to us. What is that quote?
Well, thank you for this wonderful interview, Norm, and I'm really pleased to bring it to an end with this wonderful quote by George Lamming, this great writer from the Caribbean who wrote a book called In the Castle of My Skin. And the quote is this: "It was my mother who fathered me." He goes on to say that his father only fathered the idea of him, but it was his mother who fathered him because his father wasn't around. And that resonates with me because it was my mother who fathered me. And every time I pick up a pen or I sit at a computer and I tap out a story, I honor my mother, because my mother who fathered me gave me my voice, gave me my writer's voice. I could not have written anything without my mother's voice. And so every book that I write, every piece of journalism that I pen is a tribute to my mother who fathered me.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Now, this is the big question. So many successful people, to become successful, have had struggles, hurdles, failures, whatever you like to call them. Can you let us know one of these failures or hurdles that you've had to overcome? What did you learn from it, and how did you go on from it?
That's a very good question, Norm. I'm not maybe the right person to answer the question, because I remember when I wrote my first book, I wrote a book about Marcus Garvey, and you have to write a little biography or suggest a biography for the publisher. And I wrote something like, I spent 5 years failing to be a doctor. I spent 4 years failing to be a West End playwright. I spent most of my life failing. But in a way, I don't see failing as failing. I see failing as process. And I really love the quote by Samuel Beckett, the great Irish writer, who he counseled his students or anybody who wanted to write. He'd say to them, fail again, fail better. And that's what I've done through life. I've had a string of failures, but they're getting slightly better as I go, as I get along. But also, I'm not too keen on the word success. I'd rather think about whether anything has integrity or whether anything can be said to be an achievement. And I much rather think that I've achieved things rather than I've been a success. So I have that attitude. Occasionally I'd be put up for book prizes, but I said to my publisher recently that I would not want them to submit me for any prize other than the best book written by Colin Grant prize. So I think my advice about success and failure is to recognize that they're obviously two sides of the same coin, but equally they're interchangeable and they don't have to be lasting. But I think whenever I read somebody or whenever I see something, I think not necessarily about whether the book is a success or the person is a success. I just think about whether they're my kind of person and whether they have integrity and whether they have kind of an honesty and a value that transcends their own limits, shall we say. And that's something that I recognize in my own writing. Do I have some value? Do I have something that transcends my own limits? And if so, let me find a platform for that. I brought up a Catholic, and pity the poor Catholics, right, Norm? Pity the poor Catholics. But one of the great things about being a Catholic is this. You fail, you sin all through the week, and then on Saturday, you go to confession, and you're given absolution. And the priest says, go and sin no more. But what he's really saying is go and sin again until the next time for confession. Because you're going to fail as a human being. As far as I'm concerned, the priest is saying you're going to fail, but you're going to try to do better. And if you don't manage it, we will hear your confession and you will be absolved. So I'm a great believer in that, in the idea that I'm still a work in progress. I haven't really succeeded.
I like the way that you were talking about going out there, failing, and coming back and confessing. The Hawaiians have something, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, called Ho'oponopono, which is a system of making things right. So, it's similar. You can not so much sin, but you can do something in your life but it's actually around a circle of friends, but you make it right. You approach the person, you tell them, what you've done. And anyways, I guess it's a system of confession, but it's just making it right.
I think making it right is good. I think that's an important point to make. And whenever I think about these kinds of notions about success and failure and making amends, I think of my brother. I wrote a book about my brother, Christopher, who had epilepsy, and he had sadly died from this condition called SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And he was a man I really loved, and I would go to see films with him. We shared a great love for films. Matter of Life and Death, Powell and Pressburger film is one of our favorites. But the absolute favorite film of my brother Christopher was Corniscazzi. Do you know Corniscazzi?
No.
Which is a Hopi word. It's a wonderful film. I think there's any dialogue in it. It's a film of mostly sound, chanting, and a sort of passage of time over the decades and centuries done filmically, speeded up. But there's this phrase, which is a Hopi chant, which is Koyanaskatsi, Koyanaskatsi. And it roughly translates as life out of balance. And the idea is to get life back into balance. And I think that can be achieved with humility and the recognition that you're mostly going to fail. But yeah, to rebalance, to recalibrate, to achieve a fullness, a harmony is something that I yearn for, and it doesn't keep me awake at night, but it keeps me hopeful, actually. Yeah. I'll be smiling when they lower me into the ground.
I hope I'm doing the same. Okay, so on that note, we're at the end of this podcast, and I really want to thank you for coming on. I just looked up and I just noticed that we've been going a couple hours here, and I could have easily talked to you for another couple of hours. So thank you for coming on today.
Well, Norman and Hayden, your son, thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. I've felt I've made a connection. I always like to reflect on what my mother says through life, which is find your people. And I think through I Know This Guy, I have found my people today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. And right back at you. How's that? Okay. One thing though, before you go, we always have one question we like to ask our guests. And do they know a guy?
Yes. And I have told Hayden that the guy I would recommend to you is a dear friend of mine and a great writer called Nick Rankin, who's also an author. I used to sit beside Nick Rankin in the BBC. He's a chief producer in the BBC. He's a connoisseur, a raconteur. He's the man I always wanted to be. I admire him enormously. And other than his wife, Maggie G, and my mother and my wife, there are few people who I owe a debt of gratitude to through enabling me to practice as a writer through their encouragement. So Nick Rankin is the guy that I would recommend to you.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to reach out to Nick and talk to him. Thank you again.
I'll connect you. Thank you very much. And thanks, Hayden.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye for now.
All right.
Thanks for listening, everyone. That concludes our interview with Colin Grant. Stepping up to plate next week is Jeff Bosley. Jeff is an American actor known primarily for his roles in action films. You might have seen him recently in the movie Sniper. We end up digging into Jeff's unorthodox path to becoming an actor and a bit about his time in the military, actually. Anyway, you don't want to miss it, so make sure to check it out. See you next time.